before I start with this presentation, I just want to say just a few words about me. Most of you know that I'm a PhD student at the Valras Pareto Center in the University of Lausanne. I'm writing up my thesis at the moment in a difficult condition, obviously. But I work on the history of consumption, the history of theories of consumption in American economics, mostly by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And my thesis really is about how the object of consumption, the subject of consumption, was neglected and obscured for several reasons I show in my chapters, and how notably, this is one contribution of my thesis. How notably some women maverick economists actually took up the question of consumption and consumer behavior into their expertise, and how it was actually a forgotten story. So this is really about my thesis, but I'm also really interested in reflexive literature and behavioral economics, I'm really interested in philosophy of economics and methodology as well. So this is a subject that will kind of mix things I know, things I work on, and I hope you guys learn something and have fun. So to start with, I just want to bring you this debate. This was not a debate because those two people did not actually talk about this subject. But in 1953, you had on one hand Milton Friedman, of course you know, who advocated that the realism of a theory's assumption is irrelevant. Only the predictive power of the theory matters. He wrote this approximately this. I rewrote it, I rephrased it, in the methodology of positive economics in 1953. Milton Friedman, of course, you know, is someone who was an advocate of liberal free market, and who was quite known for his public policy with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and all that. Very famous man. And George Katona, who was a psychologist, not an economist, but who was very interested in economics, said that economic theory can be improved with psychology. Economic problems are best addressed with realistic assumptions, in this famous article in 1953. So you had these two positions, quite opposite position, rather opposite. And the first one arguing realistic assumptions are irrelevant. We shouldn't care about them. And George Katona, who belonged, I'll talk about this later, but who belonged to the old behavioral economics, who's a pioneer of what we know today as behavioral economics. And I'll talk about it later. So just to give you a quick glimpse of how old is this issue, this problematic debate of realistic assumption. And of course, you can go back even earlier than that. So these are the 4 questions I want to raise in this talk. The first one is what is a realistic assumption in economics? The second one is why does it matter? Why do we even care about this subject? If people like Friedman can say we don't care, why should we care? How behavioral economics became associated with it, with the idea of a realistic science, economic science. And the fourth question, why behavioral economics approach is problematic regarding realism. And I will talk to you in a second what I mean by realism. So very briefly, what is a theory in economics? Just a quick epistemological question here. I want to get settled. A theory in economics, it's a big word. You can mean many different things when you talk about theory. You can talk about the big economic theory, which is economics. You can talk about the neoclassical theory, which is a school of thought, and you can talk about smaller theories like the nudge theories, the the Keynesian theories. You can talk about small things. An economic theory, this is Schumpeter, 1954, who said you have actually two aspects of the economic theory. You have an explanatory hypothesis, like in many other sciences. To start with the theory, to start with knowledge, you just ask, okay, I want to put to bring in an explanatory hypothesis, and then I can work on it. In economics, the second aspect is more important. Economic theory is considered as a box of tools. It's something much bigger. It's something that you don't need to prove in itself. It's that you don't need to prove because it's interesting in itself, but because you can do something else with that. You can manipulate, you can reason with this. Like the Keynesian theory, it's a box of tools. You have different concepts, and Schumpeter would say you have different gadgets. You have the law of propensity, you have many different things. So in the end, economic theory is not a unified body of knowledge. You know that. And this is the quotation from George Stigler, the Chicagoan economist. Perhaps no other science receives as much criticism from both its own members and outsiders as does economics. Economics is really, really plural. It's a plural discipline. You don't have 1, 2, 3 different schools. You have many different orthodox, heterodox, different schools. So what I mean by realism, so the quick chat we had before the talk, the beginning of the talk, led me to think that we must get the word realism the good definition. What I mean here by realism is not the big philosophical realism we can sometimes hear, like the ontological realism, the epistemological realism, all of those concepts, those expressions that say there exists an independent existence of idea, of knowledge, whatever, separated from us, which is the opposite of idealism. And this is not the definition I will use here. I will just use the definition of realistic assumption, which define how accurate a description of a phenomenon is. In economics, this debate is focused on the plausibility of the economic behavior represented in a theory or a model. So the issue of realism is essentially focused on this. So when you talk about realistic assumptions, you can have basically 3 views. You can argue with them. Maybe I just thought about it, but maybe you can find another kind of pro-realism. But these are ideal, typical views. You have the pro-realism, which basically says realism of assumption matters. We should have more accurate models, theory at various degree, but for example, institutionalist behavioral economics, institutionalists like Veblen, for example, he said that, or today Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, they would say that. The second view would be the soft anti-realism. What matters, they would say, what matters is at the aggregate level. Therefore, we do not need more than a representative agent or consumer that resembles most people. This is the most common view in neoclassical economics. This is the view that would advocate Alfred Marshall, for example, the classical English economist. The third view would be the strong anti-realism. Realism, for judging the quality of a theory, what matters is its predictive power. So you can recognize Milton Friedman's argument here. So this is a minor position. Some neoclassicals would defend this, but the second one is the biggest at the moment. So of course, when you think about realism, the naive view would say, why is there even a debate? Of course, more realism is better, right? It's some kind of a natural thinking to say of course, it's better than something that doesn't resemble, because you can sense something about the fact that it's going to be a better theory. You don't know how to explain it, but maybe you disagree, but I would say so. So why you would bother care about it? So this is something I found, maybe some of you know, tell me if you do. It's a fake description by Jorge Luis Borges, the writer from Argentina, who wrote this fake text from a fictional Suarez Miranda. And he basically said, I'll let you read it if you'd like, but he basically said that an empire from a very distant place attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province, and so on and so forth. And at the end, basically the size of the map was exactly the same size as the empire. So they wanted to add so much detail to the map that they ended up with a map as big as their empire. And in the end, in all the land there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. They went too far in details. What I want to say here is that too much details goes against the very aim of what a model or a theory is about, being something easy to use that is more convenient to manipulate than the outside world itself. This is the parsimony principle. You need to have something easy because it's useless anyway. It's useless if it's not the case. So basically, what I want to emphasize here is that a model is something different than just a mere description. A model can be manipulated and is made to be reasoned with, not just looked at. It is a machine that produces or confirms knowledge. This is what it is. So here, this text was brought here to give you an understanding of why, of course, we're not going to have a detailed study of everything in the world because it's useless. We need to theorize. So this is an example of something I've learned during my research on consumption, the debate over consumer behavior in the US, circa 1900. You basically had the marginalists, which were the pioneers of the neoclassical, basically. The marginalists were about the 1870s, and neoclassical was a term coined by Thorsten Veblen, actually, who were talking about these guys. And by 1900s, we started to use the word neoclassical. But by then, it was the marginalists. So basically, you had on one side the marginalists who would say, people like John Bates Clark, for example, in the US, who would say, well, people behave rationally. They know better what is good for themselves, should not investigate beyond their choice. And this account could, in the 1920s, become the revealed preference theory. We don't need to look beyond people's choice because their preferences are revealed through their choices. The second school by then was the institutionalist. The institutionalist basically said like people like Thorsten Veblen, well, people sometimes act irrationally, but we need to understand the true motive of their choices. We need to understand why they behave the way they do. And for that, psychology can help build a better representation of how they behave. So in the US, these two schools were not so much opposed, and not one of them was really dominant. This was called the interwar pluralism, which basically says that in the US, it was very difficult to distinguish marginalists from institutionalists because they were all in the same bundle of American progressivism. So what can we learn from this debate over consumer behavior in the US? Well, different basic assumptions whether people are rational or not, express different views on what counts as good science. For the marginalists or neoclassicals, they were emphasizing objectivity, abstraction, value-free investigation. This is what they thought as good science. For the institutionalists, on the other side, they were defending advocacy, empiricism, social control. They were more inclined with the progressive era. So, of course, the result of that is that by the 30s, 40s, the neoclassical approach became the dominant one in economics. And if you don't know this book by Mary L. Ferner, Advocacy and Objectivity, this is really a reading, a very good reading, which shows how the American economics changed, transformed itself from this advocacy progressive thing to an objectivity-based science. And of course, the advocacy, the objectivity value for investigation today is dominant now, but it was not so clear then. So different basic assumption matters because it expresses different views on what good science is. What I want to do here, am I good? Behavioral economics. So apparently some of you know a bit about behavioral economics. If I go too quickly, you can just ask me some question by the end of the presentation. I will be happy to answer them. Two things I want to emphasize here. You had basically the old behavioral economics by the 50s and 70s, with famous people like Herbert Simon or George Katona, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And you had the new behavioral economics. You now have the new behavioral economics, approximately since the 1970s. Daniel Kahneman, of course, is one of the famous proponents who won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 2002. And other people like Amos Tversky, his colleague, and Richard Thaler, for example, and many other very famous people. So you basically have, this is what you can find in the history of behavioral economics. You have the old one and the new one. So I'm going to be a bit exaggerating those two schools, but basically the first one would say that they were refusing the neoclassical assumptions and proposed new ones. It was a very different conception of rationality. The new behavioral economics, it's something that is still debated today, but the new behavioral economics would say we only modify or add some new neoclassical assumptions. Maybe I'll be glad to have some divergent opinion by the end, but this is basically what is said today, but this is the common explanation of the history of the field today. So the new behavioral economics is closer to neoclassicals than the old one. When you say that, you can look at a definition, a very famous definition of behavioral economics by Kammerer and Lorenstein, two famous behavioral economists, that says, at the core of behavioral economics is the conviction that increasing the realism of the psychological underpinnings of economics analysis will improve economics on its own terms, generating theoretical insights, making better predictions of field phenomena, and suggesting better policy. You have different things in this definition. First, you have the realism issue. The aim of the discipline is to increase realism. How to do that? Using psychology. It's about interdisciplinarity. They want to use psychology. And Daniel Kahneman himself was a psychologist, is a psychologist. The objective of this assumption increasing of realism is to improve the mainstream. It's not to build another radically different economics discipline, but to improve the mainstream, to make better predictions. Now, what behavioral economics is about. Of course, it's an experimental approach most of the time. They have many different other things. They use field data, field experiment, computer simulation, brain scan, lots of things, very different things. But there's a belief in empirical data, which is a clear departure from what was known as the classical economics of Ricardo, Marshall, and all that. They believe in gathering facts to learn something and to produce knowledge. In 2017, maybe you remember, but you had a new Nobel Prize winner in economics, which was called Richard Thaler, one of the 2-3 most famous behavioral economists. This has increased even more the high popularity and respectability of behavioral economics. And now, today, behavioral economics became the realistic economics, as I call it. It's the part of economics that is more interested in Homo sapiens rather than Homo economicus, more interested in humans rather than econs, more interested in Homer Simpson rather than Mr. Spock. This is something Richard Thaler used a lot. We want to study Homer Simpsons because people are Homer Simpson and people are not at all Mr. Spock. So it's a very popular new science. If you look at the options a policymaker has from an economic point of view, of course, you have basically 3 options. First, you can regulate. Take, for example, cigarettes. If you're a government and you want to limit the consumption of cigarettes, what will you do? First, you can regulate, use coercion, use bans. You can just make cigarettes forbidden. Secondly, you can use economic incentives. You can use taxes, subsidies. You can have an economic impact on the consumption. Or the third one is you can use non-coercive, non-incentivizing guidance, nudging, information, persuasion. Like in many countries today, when you have pictures on the packets of cigarettes. Nudging became the popular application of the new realistic economics, this new behavioral economics, which basically says, well, I'm just going to stay here just one moment. Nudge is basically a concept that was coined by Kassenstein and Richard Thaler. Maybe I'm sure some of you know about it, but it's basically an application in public policy of behavioral economics. They only take one part of behavioral economics, a small one, but it's not entirely behavioral economics. There's also common sense and many other things. But it's something that was brought in by behavioral economics. And this has a result. I'm not saying that behavioral economics has only led to this. There's many other things behavioral economics has led. Of course, nudge is only one normative expression of behavioral economics. Behavioral economics has given much more than just nudging, but it's an important part because it's a popular one, and people talk a lot about it. So, just to give you the issue now with behavioral economics that we can see nudging are the individual. So maybe I just to make sure you understand, because I assumed you guys all know what nudge was about, but a nudge is like a very small things like a spider in the toilet that uses a psychological mechanism to make people behave in a certain way or to alter preferences. I didn't put an example, but you can ask me later if you'd like. A nudge is any factor that significantly alters the behavior of humans, even though it would be ignored by the econs, the Homo economicus. This is their definition. So the problem with preferences now, in behavioral economics, and especially in nudging, you can see that there's a problem with the fact that we don't know preferences. We don't know individual preferences, and we are compelled to assume them. But we don't know whether the model would say, we are assuming them, we are deducing them from something you don't know, or we just consider them as revealed by the choice. It's very difficult to know whether preferences are rightly understood by the economist. Because since the 1920s or 30s, economists have abandoned the idea of getting behind the choice, getting behind choice, which means to understand the motive of choices. The neoclassical adopted the model of revealed preferences, Samuelson model, which means that only choices matters. We don't care about why consumer makes their decisions. And you can see that a separate line of research emerged at the same time in the 1930s, marketing research, who actually sought to understand consumers' choice, but not to build a theory of consumption to understand the demand or from an economic standpoint, but to improve firms' production and selling. So you can see how understanding preferences in consumer is something that economics has missed by the 20th century and is now starting to regain it with behavioral economics, but in a very strange way and ambiguous way, as I will show you. The second point is, well, it's a very complicated story, but idiot savants make rational fools. This is a reference, idiot savants, it's reference from a report, an American report, the COGEE, C-O-G-E-E, the COGEE report in the US in 1991, where a cabinet of the government actually made a research on the teaching in America, and they actually ended up writing in the report that graduate education in economics had created idiot savants. So economics, of course, is completely obsessed today with mathematical reasoning, and this has led to, in their terms in the report, of idiot savants. The rational fools, maybe some of you will get the reference. It's a reference of Amartya Sen's article, famous article, Rational Fools, to express how consumer is represented in economics. So idiot savants are the economists, rational fools are the consumer represented in the economic models. Idiot savants cannot make something else than rational fools. What I want to emphasize here is that idiot savants make rational fools in the sense that we will not be able to change the model if we keep teaching bad economics, basically. My third point is something brought by Gutt and Klimt. I think they are close to Gutt, Giger, and there, but I'm not sure. Is behavioral economics a neoclassical repair shop, helping mainstream economics to basically defend itself against these realistic assumption questions? Behavioral economics models today are interested in new ways of understanding preferences, endogenous, discovered social preferences, but they still rely on the same neoclassical core because these new preferences are just new factors that are treated exactly as a standard. You can disagree with that, but this is basically what the reflexive approach, the reflexive literature in behavioral economics today argue. They still rely on a utilitarianist, framework, and the goal of the theory remains the same. It has just implemented new input thanks to the behavioral research. The consumer, of course, is sovereign in economics. He knows better what he wants to buy, what he desire, and what is good for him. But we know that sometimes we behave irrationally thanks to behavioral economics. But this has led to a paradox of modern economic theory. In modern economic theory, models have difficulty to keep together two core ideas of economics. First one, the idea that most of the time people will behave rationally, which can be acceptable. We can just start saying, well, people most of the time behave rationally, so the world is coherent, rational. It's not constant chaos. This is something that could be defensible, and that there is a certain logic in human behavior. But in the same time, you cannot say that and say in the same time that such a representation should be the only standard used to build a picture of how the economic world works. This is something else. So the thing is that the idea of rationality as an assumption should remain just an assumption, not an expression of how we see the world. It's like the Rousseau-Hobbesian debate about is human good at the beginning and then society corrupts him. It's the same. I think it's the same kind of debate. So behavioral economics has demonstrated that people were not always rational, but should economics help them do so with nudging? Here there has been many discussions, both in philosophy of economics, ethics, and methodology. There are also scholars, for example, that argue a Foucauldian moment where when behavioral economics help shape Homo economicus in the real world in such a way that the model would finally resemble reality, or that reality would finally resemble the model. So my last point was the quest in this slide. My last point was that the quest for realism that was advocated at the beginning by behavioral economics is now turning into the quest for changing people's preferences, because they cannot do something else because they kept the standard framework. They started with the endeavor of improving economics by making its assumption more realistic, but it had led to another object that is now criticized today as being too paternalistic or too problematic regarding the preferences. Why should we care about what people do if we at the same time consider that they know what they do? Just checking the time. Okay. So, Andreas, am I good with the time?
I think now you have talked for 45 minutes, so
really?
we are good if we are at the end. Otherwise,
okay, yeah. No, okay.
Longer.
Yeah, I have two slides, two more slides.
Yeah, simply go on, no problem.
Okay, sorry. So now we know that. Maybe I'll just skip this and you can ask something if you'd like, but basically I just wanted to say that now it's kind of acknowledged that behavioral economics is kind of mainstream, but there's a problem with formalization in standard economics because we keep thinking that mathematical reasoning is crucial, and so we kind of trapped into this. I think this is something I wanted to emphasize more here. We can see the limit of this weak critique. It's not a radical departure from neoclassical economics. And what I want to emphasize here is to give you a glimpse of how we can build another kind of model using institutional economics on the case of consumption. So this is basically something I found in an American economics article, which basically says we need to reframe the subject of consumption. Of course, consumers are not just one single agent that make decisions, and even though we implement other inputs, other behavioral inputs, it will stay the same because we need to take into account institutions. Things like the fact that consumers are gendered agents, because, for example, when you think about the fact that consuming is also because it's also something that has to do with the creation of a family, for example, providing for your member and all that. Choice, my second point, choice is a social process. Preferences are changing, endogenous, not always consistent. We have individual tastes, meta preference, values, all are changing sometimes. My third point, consumption is not confined in the marketplace. Like Veblen used to say, we don't only consume to satisfy a utility as an economist. There are two different aspects in consumption. A ceremonial aspect, which gives prestige and helps us shape our identity by identifying to one social group or another. And an instrumental aspect that translates your own taste or satisfaction. When you buy a car, you don't just buy it to drive from a point A to B. It is not just an instrument to satisfy a need, the need to move. It is also a way to express the way you perceive yourself or the way you want people to perceive you buying this kind of brand or this model. And of course, marketing research, again, knows these very well, but economics seems to do as if it didn't exist. And my last point, capitalist is of course not the only form of economy. There are many different forms of capitalism. You can look at the work of the regulationist Robert Boyer, for example, the French regulationist. Even inside Europe, each country has a specific set of institutions, rules, norms, which cannot be compared with other countries. So there's no point in building one big model for all these different contingency. There are historical, cultural, institutional contingency that should be taken into account when we analyze economic phenomena. So, conclusion. A theory cannot be as realistic as reality, of course, but it should be as plausible as possible. Economists have been focusing too much on individual decision-making under constraint, neglecting how agents behave outside the economic framework. The issue of realism of assumption reveals the problematic view of economists on preferences, even in behavioral economics, because they're still attached to the utilitarian framework. Less psychology, more sociology, please. Of course, interdisciplinarity is a wonderful thing, but this focus on psychology has led to a problematic position of economics, the problem of the unified model to represent the agent. The question is why economics is so obsessed with having a unified representation. My answer would be probably because of the general equilibrium quest that is still shadowing on the discipline. If the agent is plural, thanks to the sociology that we can assert, we cannot have an idea if we don't. If we consider the agent of plural, as in sociology, we cannot have an idea of how market exchange occurs. And thus we cannot understand how markets at the aggregate level will behave. How will the demand and the supply behave? For almost 200 years, this has been the main task of economics, to predict how price will affect demand. But this is my very last point. Economics is a social science. Its goal should be to explain social phenomena. And the example of consumption shows that we cannot just say consumption is an economic object. No, it's a social object. We need to study with economics, psychology, anthropology, and sociology. And I will stop here. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing your question. Thanks.